That's where you will end your life, useless, silly stepdaughter.
On what should have been the happiest day of her life, 23-year-old Amber Hayes stood on the deck of a luxury yacht in her white wedding dress, staring at the woman who had made her childhood a living hell. Her stepmother Diane stood there with a twisted smile, wearing an expensive red cocktail dress that seemed deliberately chosen to upstage the bride. Diane had insisted on hosting the wedding reception on her late husband's yacht, claiming it was a generous gift, but Amber knew better. Nothing Diane did was ever generous. Behind them, the wedding guests were inside the yacht's main cabin celebrating, completely unaware of what was happening on the rear deck. Diane stepped closer to Amber and said in a venomous whisper that she'd waited years for this moment. That Amber's father had left everything to his precious daughter in his will, but now that Amber was married, Diane could finally contest it without looking like the villain. Amber's heart pounded as she asked what Diane was talking about. Diane laughed coldly and explained that she'd spent the last 6 months building a case to prove Amber was mentally unstable, unfit to manage the estate, and that dear stepmom should be the rightful heir. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My colleague said I wouldn't even reach 10,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show them that these tales matter and comment where you are watching from. Amber tried to back away but Diane grabbed her arm with surprising strength. She hissed that Amber had always been weak, just like her pathetic mother who died when Amber was 8, leaving her father vulnerable to Diane's manipulation. Amber felt tears sting her eyes as Diane continued her cruel monologue, saying that tonight, after the reception, Amber would have a tragic accident, perhaps she'd fall overboard in her heavy wedding dress, perhaps she'd simply disappear, and everyone would remember her as the unstable bride who couldn't handle married life. Amber's new husband was inside, completely oblivious, having been charmed by Diane's performance as the doting stepmother. What Diane didn't know was that Amber's older brother Marcus, who had been deployed overseas for 3 years, had just landed at the naval base 30 minutes ago and was currently racing toward the marina. Diane's grip tightened on Amber's arm as she pulled her closer to the yacht's railing. The water below was dark and churning, the yacht anchored far enough from shore that screaming would be useless. Diane told Amber that she'd planned this perfectly, that the yacht security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned tonight, that the crew had been sent away for the evening, and that when Amber's body was found in a few days, it would look like a tragic wedding night accident. Amber struggled but Diane was stronger than she looked, fueled by years of hatred and greed. She said Amber's father had been a fool to marry her at 19, that she'd spent 15 years playing the perfect wife while plotting how to take everything. She'd isolated Amber from extended family, convinced Amber's father that his daughter was troubled, and systematically positioned herself to inherit it all. The estate was worth $47 million, including properties, investments, and her father's tech company shares. Diane wasn't about to let some spoiled stepdaughter keep what should have been hers. Inside the yacht, Amber's new husband Derek was laughing with guests, raising champagne toasts, completely unaware his bride was fighting for her life 50 feet away. Diane had made sure to spike Derek's drinks earlier, nothing lethal, just enough to keep him disoriented and slow to react. She'd thought of everything. Amber managed to break free for a moment and screamed for help, but the music inside was too loud and the ocean waves swallowed her voice. Diane lunged at her again, this time with clear intent to push her overboard. She grabbed Amber's shoulders and shoved hard. Amber's feet slipped on the wet deck and she tumbled backward toward the railing, her wedding dress tangling around her legs. She grabbed desperately at the railing but Diane kicked her hands away. Amber was going over. But at that exact moment, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, powerful searchlights suddenly illuminated the yacht from the water. Second, the roar of military patrol boats surrounded them. Third, a voice boomed through a loudspeaker that made Diane freeze in absolute terror. The voice belonged to Commander Marcus Hayes, United States Navy SEAL, and he was currently standing on the deck of a Coast Guard patrol boat that had just pulled alongside the yacht with 4 other military vessels forming a perimeter. Marcus had received a frantic text from Amber 3 hours ago, a pre-written message she'd set to send automatically if she didn't cancel it, a distress signal that said if you're reading this, Diane is going to kill me at my wedding. Marcus hadn't hesitated. He'd used his military clearance to mobilize a Coast Guard response, claiming possible criminal activity on a private vessel in federal waters. Now he was watching through night vision binoculars as his sister dangled half over the yacht's railing with Diane standing over her. His blood turned to ice. Marcus barked orders into his radio, and within seconds, a tactical boarding team was scaling the yacht's hull. Diane tried to finish what she'd started, giving Amber one final shove, but Amber managed to grab a deck cleat with one hand, hanging on by her fingertips as her body swung out over the dark water. Her wedding dress was soaked and heavy, pulling her down. Diane stomped on Amber's fingers, trying to make her let go, screaming that she wouldn't let this plan fail, not after all these years. Then the boarding team hit the deck. 6 armed Coast Guard officers in full tactical gear surrounded Diane, weapons drawn, shouting commands to get on the ground. Diane's face went from rage to confusion to pure panic in 3 seconds. She stammered that this was a private event, that they had no right to board, but Marcus was already climbing over the railing. He rushed to Amber, pulling her back onto the deck and wrapping his arms around his sobbing sister. He whispered that he had her, that she was safe, that he'd never let anyone hurt her again. Diane was forced to her knees by the officers, her expensive red dress bunching around her as they zip-tied her wrists. She was screaming about lawsuits and false arrest. But her voice died when Marcus stood up and walked toward her with an expression that could have melted steel. He crouched down to her eye level and asked if she really thought she could hurt his sister and get away with it. Diane's bravado cracked as she realized who he was. Marcus stood up and addressed the Coast Guard team, informing them they'd just interrupted an attempted murder. He told them to search the yacht for evidence and to question every guest inside. Diane started screaming that this was insane, that Amber was lying, that she was the victim of a disturbed stepdaughter's imagination. But Marcus had already pulled out his phone and played the recording. Amber had been wearing a small recording device hidden in her wedding bouquet, a precaution Marcus had insisted on months ago when Amber first told him about Diane's increasingly threatening behavior. Every word of Diane's confession was captured in crystal clear audio, the plot to have Amber declared mentally unfit, the plan to make her death look like an accident, the admission that she'd manipulated Amber's father for 15 years. Diane's face went white as her own voice played back her crimes. The lead Coast Guard officer informed Diane she was being detained for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and several other charges that would be added once they completed their investigation. Inside the yacht, the wedding guests were being evacuated and questioned. Derek finally stumbled out onto the deck, still disoriented from whatever Diane had put in his drinks, and froze when he saw his bride soaking wet and traumatized, surrounded by armed military personnel, and his charming stepmother-in-law in handcuffs. He tried to process what was happening, but his drug-addled brain couldn't keep up. Marcus grabbed Derek by his tuxedo collar and asked if he'd noticed his wife was missing for 20 minutes. Derek stammered that he thought she was freshening up. Marcus shoved him away in disgust, telling him that his sister deserved better than a husband too drunk to protect her on their wedding night. Amber was wrapped in an emergency blanket, shivering from shock and cold water. A paramedic checked her vitals while she watched Diane being led away. For the first time in 15 years, Amber felt like she could breathe. But the night wasn't over yet. As they escorted Diane toward the patrol boat, she turned back and screamed at Amber that this wasn't finished, that she had lawyers who would destroy her, that Amber would regret this. Marcus stepped between them and told Diane the only thing she needed to regret was underestimating how far he'd go to protect his family. The Coast Guard transported Diane directly to federal custody while Marcus stayed with Amber. The wedding reception had turned into a crime scene investigation with guests being interviewed one by one. Several of them admitted they'd thought it was strange that Diane insisted on controlling every aspect of the reception, from the guest list to the catering to sending the yacht crew away. One guest, Amber's college roommate, revealed that Diane had approached her weeks ago trying to get information about Amber's mental health history, specifically asking if Amber had ever been diagnosed with depression or anxiety. Another guest, a distant cousin, said Diane had been asking detailed questions about the family estate and trust fund structure. The investigation was uncovering a conspiracy that went deeper than anyone realized. Marcus called his legal team, a group of military lawyers who specialized in handling complex criminal cases. They arrived within the hour and immediately began building a case against Diane. They subpoenaed her financial records and discovered she was drowning in debt, having spent years living beyond her means while waiting to inherit Amber's father's estate. She'd taken out loans using the mansion as collateral, forged documents claiming she had rights to properties she didn't own, and had been systematically stealing from the estate for the past 2 years. Amber sat in the Coast Guard station wrapped in blankets, giving her statement to investigators. She detailed years of emotional abuse, gaslighting, and manipulation. She explained how Diane had isolated her from her father in his final years, controlling his medication and access to visitors. Amber suspected Diane had hastened her father's death, though she could never prove it. The investigators took notes and assured her they'd look into every allegation. Meanwhile, Derek was being questioned separately. Under the influence of whatever Diane had given him, he admitted that Diane had approached him 6 months ago at a charity event, before he'd even met Amber. She'd introduced them deliberately, suggesting Derek pursue Amber romantically. Derek was a struggling real estate agent drowning in debt, and Diane had promised him a substantial finder's fee if he married Amber quickly. He'd been played just like everyone else, a pawn in Diane's scheme. If you're loving this justice story, smash that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. By dawn, Diane's entire criminal network was unraveling. Her lawyer, a man named Richard Chen who'd been helping her forge documents, was arrested at his home. Her accountant, who'd been helping her embezzle from the estate, turned himself in and agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her personal assistant, who'd been helping her spy on Amber and document false evidence of mental instability, broke down during questioning and confessed everything. Diane had built her scheme on loyalty bought with promises of money, but the moment those people faced prison time, that loyalty evaporated. Marcus sat with Amber in a private room at the Coast Guard station, holding her hand as she processed everything. She asked him how he'd known to come, and he explained that he'd always suspected Diane was dangerous. Before his last deployment, he'd set up the emergency text system and made Amber promise to use it if she ever felt threatened. He'd also hired a private investigator to monitor Diane's activities, which was how he knew about the debts and the forged documents. He told Amber he'd been gathering evidence for months, just waiting for Diane to make a move. Amber started crying again, this time from relief and gratitude. She said she'd felt so alone, so trapped, convinced no one would believe her about Diane's true nature. Marcus promised her those days were over, that Diane would never hurt her again. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case arrived and explained that Diane was facing multiple felony charges with a combined sentence of up to 40 years in prison. The attempted murder charge alone carried 25 years. With the evidence they had, including the audio recording and witness testimony, conviction was virtually guaranteed. Amber asked about the estate and the prosecutor assured her that all of Diane's claims would be invalidated. The forged documents would be thrown out, the stolen money would be recovered, and Amber's rightful inheritance would be protected. As the sun rose over the marina, police raided Diane's personal residence and discovered even more evidence, detailed journals where she documented her manipulation tactics, files on Amber including photos taken without consent, and shockingly, research on how to make drowning look accidental. Diane hadn't just been evil, she'd been methodical about it. 3 days later, Amber stood in a courtroom for Diane's arraignment. Diane looked nothing like the confident woman in the red dress from the wedding. She wore an orange jumpsuit, her expensive hair extensions removed, her makeup gone, revealing the hard cruel lines of her real face. She wouldn't make eye contact with Amber. The prosecutor laid out the charges one by one: attempted first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, forgery, identity theft, and elder abuse related to how she treated Amber's father in his final years. The judge's expression grew increasingly severe as each charge was read. Diane's new lawyer, a public defender since all her assets had been frozen, tried to argue for bail. The prosecutor objected strenuously, pointing out that Diane had attempted to murder her stepdaughter and had the financial means to flee the country if released. The judge agreed and denied bail. Diane would remain in custody until trial. As she was led away, Diane finally looked at Amber. There was no remorse in her eyes, only hatred and fury at being caught. She mouthed the words, "This isn't over." But it was over, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Outside, Marcus wrapped his arm around Amber's shoulders and they walked through a crowd of reporters who'd caught wind of the sensational story. Headlines were already forming: socialite stepmother arrested for attempted murder at stepdaughter's wedding. The story went viral on social media within hours. People who'd known Diane from her country club and charity circuit came forward with their own stories of her cruelty and manipulation. Former friends revealed she'd borrowed money and never repaid it, stolen jewelry and blamed household staff, and spread vicious rumors about anyone she perceived as a threat. The perfect image she'd cultivated for 15 years shattered completely. Amber's soon-to-be ex-husband Derek tried to contact her multiple times, claiming he'd been manipulated and wanted another chance. Amber blocked his number. Marcus's legal team was already filing annulment papers on grounds of fraud, since Derek had admitted to marrying her under false pretenses for financial gain. The marriage would be dissolved as if it never happened. Amber moved out of the mansion she'd shared with Diane and into a secure apartment while deciding what to do with the estate. She couldn't bear to live in that house filled with terrible memories. 2 months later, the trial began. The prosecution's case was devastating. They played the audio recording of Diane's confession, brought forward the witnesses who'd helped her criminal scheme, and presented the journals documenting years of premeditated abuse and fraud. Amber testified about years of psychological torture, about being isolated and gaslit, about watching her father decline under Diane's care while being unable to help him. Medical experts testified that Amber's father's death, originally ruled as natural causes from his heart condition, showed signs consistent with medication tampering. They couldn't prove murder definitively, but they could prove Diane had been controlling his medication in ways that likely hastened his death. The defense had nothing. They tried to paint Amber as a vindictive stepdaughter making false accusations, but the audio recording destroyed that narrative. They tried to claim Diane had been joking about pushing Amber overboard, but the Coast Guard officers testified to what they'd witnessed, including Diane stomping on Amber's fingers as she hung from the railing. Every strategy failed. Marcus attended every day of the trial, sitting directly behind Amber in his military dress uniform, a silent reminder to Diane that she'd messed with the wrong family. Other Navy personnel who'd served with Marcus also showed up in support, filling the courtroom with uniformed service members. The visual impact was powerful, and the jury noticed. On the 7th day of testimony, Diane's former personal assistant took the stand and provided the most damning evidence yet. She revealed that Diane had specifically planned the wedding reception on the yacht because it provided an opportunity for an untraceable accident. She'd researched ocean currents, studied how long it would take a body to surface, and even practiced pushing a weighted mannequin off the yacht's railing to ensure Amber would go far enough out to be carried away by the current. This wasn't a crime of passion or impulse. This was cold, calculated, premeditated murder. The courtroom gasped. Even the defense attorney looked shaken. Diane sat stone-faced, but her hands were trembling. The prosecution rested their case and the defense called no witnesses, knowing anything they presented would only make things worse. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Diane guilty on all charges. When the verdict was read, Diane finally broke. She started screaming at the jury, at the judge, at Amber, that they didn't understand, that she'd earned that money, that she'd wasted the best years of her life married to Amber's father and deserved compensation. Her public defender tried to quiet her, but she wouldn't stop ranting about how unfair it all was, how Amber had everything handed to her while Diane had to fight for scraps. It was a horrifying display of narcissism and entitlement that sealed her fate. 3 weeks later at sentencing, the judge showed no mercy. He sentenced Diane to 35 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 20 years. He stated that her crimes were particularly heinous because she'd abused a position of trust, targeted a vulnerable young woman who'd already lost her mother, and shown absolutely no remorse. He said society needed to be protected from people like Diane who viewed other human beings as obstacles to be removed. Diane was led away screaming and crying, her carefully constructed life completely destroyed. All of her assets were seized to repay the money she'd stolen from the estate. Her luxury condo was sold, her designer clothes and jewelry auctioned off, her country club memberships revoked. She became a cautionary tale in the social circles she'd once dominated. Amber stood outside the courthouse and gave a brief statement to the press. She said she was speaking out because she wanted other people in abusive situations to know they weren't alone and that justice was possible. She thanked her brother for never giving up on her and for literally saving her life. She thanked the Coast Guard and the investigators who'd taken her case seriously. And she said she was finally free to live the life her father had wanted for her, without fear or manipulation. Marcus stood beside her, still in uniform, and told reporters that his sister was the strongest person he'd ever met. The media coverage was overwhelmingly supportive, with domestic abuse organizations reaching out to share Amber's story as an example of how abusers often hide behind respectable facades. 6 months after the trial, Amber had transformed her life completely. She'd sold the mansion that held so many bad memories and bought a smaller, beautiful home overlooking the ocean. She'd taken control of her father's estate and her inheritance, using part of it to establish a foundation in her father's name that helped young people who'd lost parents and were being exploited by guardians or relatives. The foundation provided legal assistance, counseling, and financial support. She enrolled in business school to learn how to manage her inheritance wisely and to eventually run her father's company. She started therapy to process the trauma of growing up under Diane's abuse and the attempted murder. Slowly, she was healing. Marcus visited whenever his deployment schedule allowed, and their bond was stronger than ever. Amber had also started speaking publicly about psychological abuse in families, particularly the kind inflicted by step-parents on vulnerable children. Her story resonated with thousands of people who'd experienced similar situations. She received letters from people thanking her for giving them courage to speak up about their own abusive relatives. Derek tried one more time to reconcile, showing up at her new house with flowers and apologies. Amber told him through her security intercom that he'd chosen money over protecting her, that he'd been so drunk and drugged at their wedding that he didn't even notice she was missing. And that she'd never forgive him for being so weak. She told him to move on with his life because she'd already moved on from him. She never saw him again. The annulment was finalized and Amber felt no regret about ending that chapter. As for Diane, she was miserable in federal prison. The other inmates knew her story and had no sympathy for someone who tried to murder her stepdaughter for money. She'd been attacked twice in her first 6 months and spent most of her time in protective custody, isolated and bitter. She filed multiple appeals but every one was denied. She'd spend the next 20 years behind bars, exactly where she belonged. 1 year after that terrible wedding night, Amber stood on the deck of a boat again, but this time it was different. She was with Marcus and a small group of close friends, scattering her father's ashes in the ocean according to his wishes. She said a prayer thanking him for loving her, for protecting her through his will even after his death, and for giving her a brother who'd never let her down. As the sun set over the water, Amber felt truly at peace for the first time in 15 years. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served, and her life was finally, completely, beautifully her own. What did you think of Amber's journey from victim to survivor? Drop a comment with your thoughts on family betrayal, the importance of having people who protect you, and second chances. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of justice and resilience. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and share it with anyone who needs to hear that escape is possible. Turn on notifications so you never miss our next upload. What story should we tell next? Let us know in the comments below.